I had anticipated that BYU would be investing in their defensive line via the transfer portal this offseason, but Kelly Poppinga's comments indicate that BYU, in fact, is betting on continuity and development of the guys they already have as being the difference.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. I'm Jake Hatch, 14-year credentialed media member at BYU and your resident expert and insiders, your host here on this show. And as always, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. And thank you to all of you who make us at Locked On America's #1 sports podcast network. Coming up on today's show, we're going to look at BYU's defensive line and why Kalani, Sitake, Kelly Poppinga, and their brain trust expects that the guys that are already on campus will prove to be the difference in the trenches for them, despite thoughts that they may go out into the transfer portal to upgrade that position. Then we're going to talk about a bit of a surprise addition to BYU's roster via the transfer portal. Who is Jake Clifton, and why does his experience already in the Big 12 at Kansas State actually portend good things for the BYU Cougars? We'll get into that, and they'll finish up today's show previewing tonight's late-night showdown at the Marriott Center. BYU and TCU squaring off, what to expect from the Horned Frogs as they come to Provo. We'll get to all that. It's all ahead on today's show, and it's all brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Of course, the college football playoff is here, and FanDuel is the best place to get in on the action all playoff long. Visit FanDuel.com to get your college football playoff profit boosts every single game day. All right, so if you missed it, Kelly Poppinga appeared on BYU Sports Nation. I think it was late last week, shortly after he was elevated to the title of defensive coordinator for the BYU football program. And in that conversation, he indicated that they actually are not going to be investing, at least to our knowledge, in bringing in transfer portal guys for BYU's defensive line. Now, I thought he had a pretty good answer for it because he kind of indicated that BYU, they have essentially have 4 roster slots allocated essentially for every position on the roster due to the change with the House settlement of the roster limits being lowered to 105-man rosters versus in the past when they had 123-man rosters. That indicates that I think that there is 2 things going in favor of BYU, going the route of betting on continuity and development on that defensive line, because it kind of stands in stark contrast to what BYU is doing on the offensive line that we talked about yesterday for those of you who are everydayers. They've added 3 offensive linemen so far, and all indications are that they're not going to be done on the offensive front quite yet when it comes to the transfer portal. So TJ Woods and Aaron Roderick, they are investing on their offensive line, whereas Kelly Poppinga and Kalani Sitake, Gary Anderson, etc., they're doubling down on the guys they already have in that defensive meeting room. I understand it on its head because if you look at the numbers, BYU's not losing a lot of guys from last year's defensive line. Logan Latui exits on the defensive end side of things. Kafusi Pakofe, who was a guy brought in to fill out depth on the defensive line, he exits the program. And we are also still awaiting the word officially on if John Taumoepeau is going to be able to get another year of eligibility. He has petitioned the NCAA using that Diego Pavia rule to get his year of JUCO ball back to hopefully come back and play for BYU. Outside of those 3 individuals, BYU's top 4 guys almost at every position are intact. And I think that is the way that BYU kind of likes it, because there were moments that BYU's defensive line had some good showings in it. Now, going up against the likes of Texas Tech, that's where you kind of thought, okay, Texas Tech invested somewhere between $7 and $8 million, according to reports, along their defensive front. David Bailey, Romello Height, Lee Hunter, Gil Howard Gill. They had some really elite defensive linemen, and it proved to be effective to get them to the college football playoff. And I thought when I was at that Big 12 championship game, watching that game play out, I think Kalani Sitake can look right across the field here. And I said as much on podcasts, both in the day of the game, in the aftermath, in that postcast, as well as in days following it, that I thought that the archetype of what BYU needed to do when it came to challenging for Big 12 supremacy was to model themselves after Texas Tech. Well, Texas Tech has invested heavy money on the defensive line, and they've doubled down on that again in this most recent transfer portal cycle. We'll see if BYU's philosophy, where they're kind of going against the grain here and betting on the guys they already have in-house and expecting that, yeah, with more development, work in the weight room, working on their skills, pass rush moves for defensive ends, and betting on continuity and guys understanding the system better in year 2, 3, or 4 of however long they've been in this defense for BYU, the hope is that will pay off and BYU will have the horses in the trenches to compete with the likes of Texas Tech and to compete for a college football playoff berth, if not a Big 12 title before that. It's an interesting dynamic at play here because there's different philosophies, as always there is, and BYU is doing something that's, I thought, off the track and off what I thought they would ultimately do. So we'll see how it all goes. Now, on paper, BYU has some very, very nice options. Let's start with the defensive tackles. Keanu Tanuvasa announced he's coming back for another year. He told me at Big 12 Media Days last year that he was going to be a one-year guy in Provo, and I don't think the season went the way he expected to. I think he expected in his heart of hearts and his mind to be more dominant than he was, and frankly put, he wasn't, so that's why he's back for another year. Alongside him, if Nusi Taumoepeau comes back, I think he's the most underappreciated defensive player BYU has on that defensive line. He makes play after play and seemingly doesn't get the credit. Then you also have Justin Kirkland, a guy that came in via the transfer portal last year, had some knee issues that precluded him from really competing at a high level for more than just the 4 games that BYU had him for. They redshirted him. The hope he's going to be 100% healthy this fall, and he can show more of what he showed at Oklahoma State and before that Utah Tech and become a force on that defensive front as just a 340-pound mauler in the middle. If you have those 3 guys delivering, that's good news for BYU, and that doesn't even preclude a guy like Anisi Purcell, who I think is a very capable player in his own right, and then a young buck in Fetuli. Actually, Uluave of Fetuli, but goes by Fetuli. I thought he had moments as a true freshman last year of a guy you're like, okay, that dude's got some juice and could be a fantastic player down the stretch. So on paper, there are bodies there. How much better can they get this offseason? Well, they need to get a whole lot better to be able to hold up, like I said, against the top end of the Big 12 conference. You can't just expect that it's going to be Texas Tech and everybody once again. There are going to be other teams out there, Utah among others, who have got every intention of coming for the perch that BYU is on, whether they're the second best team or whatever. They want to knock BYU out of that position and establish themselves in those spots. And that defensive line play, it's going to be critical. Now, out on the edges, BYU has guys like Hunter Clegg, Orion Maile-Kafusi, Tausili Akana. Bodie Schoonover will be the elder statesman this coming year. And then you also have Viliami Apuha, who I think that all 5 of those guys have shown flashes of being very, very solid players on the edge for BYU. Can they take that next step and go from being solid to outright stars? That is what you're hoping for here. And also, I can't even discount Nusi Taumoepeau. Now, Nusi kind of played a hybrid role, some linebacker, some defensive end. But the one thing that he could do when he showed up at BYU was rush the passer. BYU has to be able to generate a pass rush with its front 4 for this defense to succeed at a very, very high level. And there were moments last year that we actually saw that pass rush deliver with a 4-man front. Can it deliver once again in 2026, and can it elevate itself where it can really be a force? That's what BYU is betting on here. I'm interested to see how it goes because it really is kind of a unique philosophy here. When other programs out there look at Texas Tech, look at how much money they invested in the defensive front and look how far it took them, you would think that BYU might be inclined to say, okay, we're going to do that exact same thing. But they decided to walk a different path, and ultimately, we're going to see in the end if it was the right one. Could it be a year from now that we're talking about the outcome of the 2026 season? Say, man, you know what? They probably should have invested a little more on that defensive line in the transfer portal last year, and it probably would have made the difference. We very well could be saying that, or we could be saying, man, once again, Kalani Sitake's belief in his guys in-house and believing that they could be the difference proved to be the masterstroke that helped BYU accomplish what they accomplished. So very, very curious things to pay attention to. And there's also going to be some newcomers coming back. The guys coming home off of missions. I'm actually currently working on a list for those of you who are inevitably going to ask, well, hey, what return missionaries is BYU going to have? I'll have more on that for you guys in a future edition of the podcast. But I do know of 2 defensive linemen coming in via high school, the high school route. Those include Nehemiah Kalani as well as Braxton Lindsay. Now, Kalani figures to be a defensive tackle down the line, but he's more of a defensive end size right now. So maybe you can factor him in at that 3rd spot on the tackle depth chart. And Lindsay, he was a standout linebacker down there in Arkansas, and I thought he would end up playing linebacker at BYU. But when they announced his signing during the early signing window, they announced him as a defensive end. So there are some guys coming in that hopefully can add to the mix here, but there's a lot of bodies, a lot of the mouths to feed out there, and I think we just scratched the surface of how many other guys could contribute here. But the competition in spring ball, and we'll see if it ultimately comes to fruition during the 2026 season. But BYU absolutely needs this defensive line to deliver, because if it doesn't, well, it could see BYU backslide a little bit next year. But if it succeeds, how much further could they go? Could they win a Big 12 title? Could they make the college football playoff? All of that is on the horizon and within reach, it appears, on paper. Coming up next, though, we're going to talk about a guy that's going to add to BYU's defense. And I think the interesting dynamic at play here is he already has Big 12 experience. He's already a guy who knows what it takes to succeed at this level, but with a logjam of bodies at that position, how much opportunity will he actually get to contribute? We'll talk about that next. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. The college football playoff is here, and FanDuel is giving all customers even more ways to get in on the action every single game day of the playoff. And, of course, we have the national championship coming up on Monday night. Because right now, every college football playoff game day, FanDuel users get a profit boost waiting for them in the app. The best part about it, you get that profit boost to elevate the bets you're already making. If you want to pick Indiana as the favorite to win the national title, you can do that. If you want to believe in the Miami Hurricanes and their ability to upset the Hoosiers, you can take that, or you can build a parlay around players, outcomes, all the different things that might happen in that game. Then you apply that profit boost and go after even bigger winnings. And when you win, FanDuel pays out instantly, which is perfect for playoff football. So FanDuel is the best place to get on the action all playoff long. Visit FanDuel.com to get your college football playoff profit boost every single game day. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. And thank you to all of you for making Locked On America's #1 sports podcast network. All right, so if you didn't see it yesterday, BYU have formally announced the addition of Cade Uluave, who was an incredible signing, in my opinion, because he's the #1 rated transfer portal linebacker, according to multiple outlets. He was a top 50 portal guy overall. It made a statement for BYU. If you want more insight on Cade, go back to yesterday's podcast as an everydayer and check that out. But they also announced the signing of Clifton yesterday as well. Now, both of these players, Cade Uluave and Clifton, are both linebackers. Cade coming to BYU by way of Cal, and Clifton coming to BYU by way of Kansas State. Now, the Clifton story is a bit of a cliffhanger, pardon the pun, is because this is a young man who has not played football since 2023. And you're probably saying, what happened here? Well, he is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And when he enrolled at Kansas State, if you go back, there's a video I think that BYU TV put out of him talking about how he had considered going on a mission, but he wanted to go to Kansas State and really show what he could do as a freshman, and ended up playing in 11 games that year as a true freshman for Kansas State. And it wasn't just special teams duty. He played every linebacker spot. He played in the Big 12 title game in 2022 and proved to be a very capable depth piece, and figured, okay, well, sophomore year, I could take the next leap and maybe end up as a starter. And that's, in fact, what happened for 3 of the 8 games he played in 2023 before suffering a knee injury that ended his season in 2023. But Clifton was a guy that Kansas State and what they had built on defense were looking at as being a kind of a future star in their defense. Well, then after that knee injury, he, according to what he talked about, he was thinking about going on a mission. He went and talked to the coaching staff, and they said, well, what's this all about? And he explained it to him. They said, hey, there are bigger things than football, and if this is what you want to do, we support you in it. So he ultimately left to serve a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I think he went to Central America, if I recall, and now he's back. He recently returned from his mission and is going to be a BYU Cougar. I think BYU is going to benefit here because the changeover at Kansas State. They just had a head coaching change. And when a head coaching change happens, especially in the case of a guy like Clifton, where you're coming home off of a mission, you have a new coach, Colin Klein, who is a Kansas State legend in his own right, but he's probably wondering, okay, who is this Clifton kid? Where has he been for the last couple of years? And I think Clifton maybe be thinking, you know what? Maybe it's time to try something different. And to Kansas State's loss is BYU's gain here. And Clifton, if he can regain the form he had as a freshman and sophomore at Kansas State in the 2 years of eligibility he's got remaining, he also does have a redshirt year as well. he could end up as a starting caliber linebacker for BYU. But my question is, where does he slot in here? Because I'm figuring that Isaiah Glasker, Siale Esera, and I think Cade Uluave are the names I would pencil in as BYU starting linebackers next year. And you also have to include the likes of Ace Kafusi, Miles Hall, Nusi Taumoepeau, Micah Kafusi. There are a lot of bodies in that linebacking room who are chomping at the bit for a chance to play. And then you add, Jake Clifton to the mix. Clifton is going to have an edge, I think, on some of these guys because he already succeeded at a very high level. He started Big 12 games. He's played in a Big 12 title game. He knows what it takes to succeed at this level. And reading some of the stories on him before he embarked on his mission, it was interesting to hear that the coaching staff absolutely raved about his positional versatility. They believed in their defense, which they ran a 3-3-5 under the previous regime out there. And we'll see what ultimately ends up being for Kansas State going forward. But he can play any one of those three linebacker spots. And that's where I think he factors into the race here. He can play any one of the spots so long as he learns them adequately and can succeed at each of those positions, whether it's the sandbacker that Isaiah Glasker occupies, Mac backer, which is what Siale Esera typically plays. And Jack Kelly is vacating that weak side linebacker, the wheel, and that could end up being Cade Uluave's spot. But a guy like Jake Clifton could factor in here as a guy who can spell any of those guys at any point at any one of those positions if his versatility and what his coaches said about him at Kansas State still holds true. It's a very, very interesting dynamic here because if Clifton is as good as he was before that knee injury and then ultimately having to go out, not having to, but deciding to go out on a mission for 2 years, as he works his way back, how quickly can he get back into what they call game shape? Can he get that mission rust off of him, which is a legitimate thing? Certain guys are able to get rid of it very quickly. Other guys take a longer time to get rid of it. But once he's up and running, this adds a whole nother just kind of element to the battle here at linebacker. Kelly Poppinga is going to have a lot of decisions, I think, when it comes to being defensive coordinator and, as anticipated, also coaching up BYU's linebackers. And I'm very curious to see how he goes about deploying these guys because we also have seen in this day and age of college football, more and more you're playing just a 2 linebacker set in terms of playing 4 down defensive linemen, 2 linebackers, and 5 defensive backs. BYU has morphed it a little bit. Jay Hill did this with a 3-3-5 look. It was 3 down linemen, 3 linebackers, and 5 defensive backs. And that's all, I think, in an effort to get BYU's best players on the field. But if a guy like Jake Clifton is right there and he's as good as anybody in front of him, how do you go about fixing that issue? I'm interested to see where it all plays out, but I do think that Jake Clifton's pickup here cannot be ignored. I think that Cade Uluave, in my opinion, is an absolute home run pickup for BYU football. He is going to be an absolute star in this defense because he was already a star at Cal, and he has no intention, I think, of coming to BYU and taking a backseat to anybody. And yes, I know that Siale Esera and Isaiah Glasker have got multiple years of experience and starting experience at that, and starring roles as well for BYU. But those 3 are going to be very, very good. And I think Jake Clifton, given adequate time to get himself back in shape, by the time the season rolls around, who's to say that he's not going to be right there in the middle of the fray, showing what he showed early on in his time at Kansas State and showing that, this is a guy who was on an arc, it looked like, to end up being a Big 12 force. Because that's kind of the trajectory. If you read these stories about Jake Clifton, that was the trajectory they envisioned for him when he got there. And that's awesome. That shows the BYU is doing some very, very meticulous work in the transfer portal. They're not taking a shotgun approach. We talked about it previously for those of you who listen every single day, about where it's not the shotgun approach where you're kind of taking all comers. No, it's more of a kind of a sniper or a targeted approach where you're saying, I want that guy, I want this guy, I want that guy. And you're bringing in very specific individuals because you understand, A, they fit the culture, B, they can play at a very high level, and C, the expectation is that they come in and add, not detract from what BYU hopes to accomplish in 2026, and that is chasing a Big 12 title. That is playing for a national championship in the college football playoff, etc. Very interesting times, but I think that this pickup, it should not be ignored. It should not be overlooked saying, wow, it's just some RM. No, this is a guy who played some high-level ball, played in a Big 12 title game, and played a major role in said title game, and obviously has the skills to really be a force for BYU's defense. And I'm interested to see if he can become that same type of a player for the BYU Cougars. All right, we'll finish up today's show coming up momentarily. Big game tonight at the Marriott Center. It's a late one. It's going to be a 9 o'clock tip Mountain Time as BYU and TCU square off. What to expect from the Horned Frogs, and can BYU run their Big 12 schedule, their Big 12 record to 4-0? Well, I think they have a very, very good chance of doing just that. We'll talk about it here momentarily. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Appreciate all of you for your support of the podcast. Love people who interact with the show that want to send in stuff for us to test out. This is from Letterman Golf. They've got some really cool head covers for golfers out there, and I'm a big golfer myself. That's a driver cover. It's like full grain leather. I'm loving this stuff. And Alex and the team at Letterman Golf asked me if I would test it out and give them some feedback, and I figured I'd give them a little shout out on the podcast as well. I'm not being paid for it. They're kind enough to send it over to me to test it out, and I will have feedback for them. But if you want to check that out as well, go to lettermangolf.com. You can check out all the different things. And even if you are not a BYU fan, I don't know why you're watching the show if you are, but if you want other teams, Utah State, etc., they've got gear for you out there as a fan as well if you're a golfer to support your teams. Check it out, lettermangolf.com. All right. Let's talk about BYU basketball. They are going to be in action tonight. It is a 9 p.m. tip at the Marriott Center, and that is very, very late on a school night. And yours truly, as many of you know, produces a morning radio show, DJ and PK, on the KSL Sports Zone every single morning. And I'm not going to lie, I am very reticent to ever miss a home game. But I'm telling you guys, just with how the timing is going to work out, yours truly is probably not going to be at the Marriott Center tonight. I'm probably watching it from home just because it's so late. By the time I were to get home, we're talking midnight. My alarm goes off at 4 a.m. I'm not here to complain. I'm just saying it's a very late night, and I don't think I'm the only one in that boat debating on if you're going to go down to Provo for this game. But looking at it on its head, this is an opportunity for BYU to cap the easiest 4-game stretch of their Big 12 slate, and they are only playing 18 Big 12 games. So you're now almost about a quarter of the way. I know that with 18, you're not quite there, but you're almost a quarter away through the schedule, and you would like to run this to 4-0. But TCU, they're a dangerous team. They're the best of these 4 that BYU has faced so far, obviously starting off with Kansas State, home to Arizona State, at Utah, now home to TCU. And obviously looming on the horizon is BYU's first true ranked versus ranked matchup in Big 12 play, that being Texas Tech on Saturday in Lubbock. So BYU obviously has to keep their eye on things at hand, and that's that game tonight as they take on TCU. And this is going to be a game that TCU may throw what BYU kind of did a year ago at BYU, and we're going to see how BYU responds to it. And what I mean by that is, remember, I talked all the time last year, for those of you who can remember all the way back, and I don't blame you if you can. I do almost 300 episodes a year. But we talked during the basketball season last year that I kept thinking, you know what? At some point, Kevin Young's going to cut down this rotation. It's good. The 10, 11, 12-man rotation he's running, it won't work. And he's an NBA guy, and NBA coaches usually like to have a 7, 8, maybe 9 at the most man rotation. Well, it never happened. And BYU, to their everlasting credit, understood that the 11, 12 men that they could throw on the court came in waves of people and proved to be a big part of BYU's success, ultimately ending in a Sweet 16 berth in the NCAA tournament. So I think that what we have seen is BYU can do this in terms of if they have the right guys, they'll throw people at them. BYU's bench this year, it's not that deep. In fact, I think that an 8-man rotation is at max right now for BYU. If you factor in, I think, Hadim Boop, Abdullah Ahmed, or Bidu as they call him, and then essentially it looks like for right now, you factor in Tyler Murras. So those are the 8 guys BYU is relying upon. And the team they're playing tonight, speaking of TCU, they throw 9, maybe 10 guys out on the court at any given point. Because you look at their stats, they're a pretty balanced team. And like I said, they're kind of like BYU was a year ago, where I know that Yegor Demon and Dallin Hall and Richie Saunders all had their moments last year, but the balance of BYU was a major calling card last year. This year, BYU is led by a big 3. And that's kind of in stark contrast to what TCU is going to throw at them tonight. I'm genuinely curious to see which philosophy wins out here. Obviously, I'm hoping that BYU handles their business, and the indications are the sports books, BPI, Basketball Percentages Index from ESPN, KenPom.com, all favor BYU very heavily to the tune of like almost 90% win probability. So The Cougars are expected to win this game, but I'm telling you, I think that the versatility and the depth of TCU could be an interesting dynamic to see if BYU can handle it. They have two guys in the front court who are absolute bruisers. And David Punch, that's a great name for a guy that's his size. He's at 6'7", 250-pound forward, kind of old school tight end, like mold power forward type guy. And then Xavier Edmonds, 6'8", and about the same size, like 245, 250 pounds. They are a tough combo on the interior because they've got not necessarily elite height in terms of the length, but they've got size and they got mass. And how's BYU deal with that? Because typically BYU starts just Keba Keita and they kind of a four out, one in alignment on their lineup. But having two bully ball type guys on the interior, how are they going to combat that? Do you put a guy like Kennard Davis Jr. out there and expect that despite him being undersized, can he hold up against these guys? Or do you throw a Hadim Boop out there and say, okay, you've got to be able to take and absorb some of this? That'll be an interesting dynamic here. And obviously there's a local connection as well. With TCU, Tanner Toolson, who once upon a time was a BYU Cougar, then transferred to UVU and is now playing for the TCU Horned Frogs. Well, he obviously will want to come back to the program he once called home, and his dad, and he's got cousins and brothers who have all been associated with BYU basketball for years. He wants nothing more to make a homecoming and shine against his former team. He's kind of been relegated to a little bit of a bench role. I think, about 7 points per game on the year. So he's not been the star, I think, that maybe he hoped he would be at TCU, but he's part, like I said, that kind of balanced rotation that TCU is going to throw at BYU in this game. And I'm interested to see how this ultimately goes, because I don't think TCU is imminently in terms of like a beast in terms of you can't contain them, but they're very capable of beating you up. And that's going to be the dynamic of play here is, can BYU's big three, AJ DeBonsa, Richie Saunders, Rob Wright, can they lead the way for BYU as they've done all season long and prevail in the end over, I said, the balance that TCU, the waves, I should say, that TCU might be able to throw on the court against the Cougars. So I'm interested in Jamie Dixon, by the way. He's one of those coaches who's been around the game forever, spent years at Pitt, obviously, as a TCU alum. So when he left the Panthers, going home to coach TCU was pretty natural. And he's done some very, very nice things. And this is a TCU team that I think in time could end up being an NCAA tournament team. And if you look at the projections right now, only 7 Big 12 teams are slated currently in the bracketology to make the NCAA tournament. But TCU, I think they've got that capability in them, and they'll want nothing more than to be able to knock off that would be a top 15 team now in BYU, who's ranked number 11, to bolster their resume. So take care of business if you're BYU. And like I said, the kind of the dynamic of these two forces equal going at one another. I'm just genuinely curious to see how they kind of counter one another in a game of this magnitude. We'll also see how the body clock factors into this, because this is going to be a 10 p.m. Body clock game for TCU because they're on Central Time typically. 9 o'clock's late for BYU in and of itself, and it's late for guys like me who do morning radio for their day job, and I think for a number of you who would like to take your kids out to the game. So don't be surprised if they're a little, maybe a little, I'm trying to say, a few more extra empty seats at the Marriott Center tonight than you otherwise might have expected for Big 12 play. But this is not the only 9 o'clock game BYU is going to have on the docket. There's actually a handful more of them and at home too. So it's not ideal. Like I said, it's a weeknight, and I get you're going to keep your kid up till 11, midnight, 1 a.m. I'm not. So I don't blame any of you if you decide, you know what, I'm biting the bullet here, and maybe sell your tickets, maybe give them away, but still, if you can, get other Cougar fans a chance to go out to the game who may otherwise not get that opportunity, because it is still an extremely hot ticket. It's not easy to get these tickets to games at the Marriott Center, but I look forward to this. I'll be watching it on TV. Of course, I'll be interacting on social media and the like. And as always, you guys are welcome to interact as well. Always appreciate all the support you guys give this show. So that's going to do it. Interesting dynamic of play, as I mentioned, with these two kind of different philosophies of the lineups for TCU and BYU. And we'll see if the Cougars once again can run their Big 12 record to 4-0, make it 13 wins in a row, and ultimately gear up for their first ranked opponent matchup, I should say, in Big 12 play against Texas Tech on Saturday. So as always, truthfully, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your support of the podcast. Want to encourage you guys to join the Locked On Cougars Everydayer Club. They're doing a great job in terms of providing extra content that we've got for you guys. Get access to a members-only Discord. If you want to join that, you can either join at the $5 tier or the $15 tier, and they also have different perks at each tier. But check it out. It's lockedoncougars.supercast.com, or click the link in the show notes below. That's lockedoncougars.supercast.com. But as always, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Make your second listen of the day our friends over at Locked On Big 12 or Locked On College Football. I'll give you a choice on either one. And as always, come back tomorrow and be an everydayer right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.